Okay, today we are learning about how to make a handmade stamp out of clay. And so the first stamp that we're going to be working on making is one that is just a simple shape. And so I have some designs here that I've kind of thought through, and I want something that will repeat and line up with itself nicely. So I feel like I'm going to go with this one. So I have some of my tools ready. I have a canvas wrap board. I have a fettling knife. I have some tools for making lines and mark making, a needle tool, some dental tools, and things like that I think will be helpful. And I have my piece of clay. So there's two different ways to make a stamp with this pattern. One of them is going to be subtractive, where you are taking away the clay and leaving only that form raised and showing. And the other way is also subtractive, but a different approach, where you are carving that design into a prepared shape. So I'm going to show you how to do both those things with this piece of clay. Okay, so I'm going to start with this one, and any clay I'm not using I'm going to keep wrapped up. So I'm going to start out with this piece of clay. So I'm going to get it into a nice square shape. That is going to be the shape that I want for the outside edges of my stamp. So I'm going to kind of get it squared up, and then after that I'm just going to trim the edges so they're the exact size and shape that I want them to be. So anytime I use my fettling knife, I'm going to clean the blade off before I make the next cut, so that I'm not leaving little bits of clay on my edges, so that it's nicely squared up. So I'm making sure to wipe them all. Okay, so I have a really good smooth block for the part that is going to be the stamp. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw this on to the piece of clay, remembering that whatever I do, when I turn it over and stamp it, it's going to be the reverse of that. And so if I want it to look like that when I stamp it, I need to flip the image in the other direction. So I'm just going to kind of draw it on here, and I'm reversing it. Okay, so I'm going to brush off any edges or bits that I don't need. And now that I have that shape on there, I'm brushing off the pieces that I don't want to show. I'm going to go in and I'm going to get that really, really clean. So I'm going to come in here with some of my tools and work on smoothing that out. So I have this silicone tool that I'm going to get in here. And one of the things I have to keep in mind is I want my grooves to be deep enough and wide enough that the clay can kind of squoosh into the stamp when I use it. Okay, so I'm going to use my fingers, I'm going to use my tools to make wide open V-shaped grooves so that there is actually space for the clay to squeeze down into those openings. So you can see if I tilt it that the grooves that I'm making are going to be a deep V shape, which gives the clay room to get into those openings. And periodically I like to just kind of lightly tap it on the table to smooth out my top surface so I can see how it's going to look more clearly. So here we go. So we're carving it in to the clay. So the thing I have to think about too is with this approach, the edge shape of my stamp is going to show up. So I'm going to have these square edges. So when I'm finished incising my design, I have to make sure those edges are clean and smooth and look exactly the way I want, because they are absolutely going to show when I stamp this. Okay, so I keep tightening it up, keep smoothing it out until I get the exact shape that I want. I'm going to come in here with my tools, and I'm going to rotate my stamp so that I can look at it from the angle that is most convenient for what I need to do with my hand, the motion that I need to make. So I'm going to get those nice and wide open so that my clay can fit down inside the grooves when I'm using it as a stamp. So one of the things you always want to avoid is any little messy wads of clay. And any texture that is on this is going to transfer to my clay when I stamp it. So if you look at the sides, you can see those grooves are pretty deep, but this one is quite a bit more open than this one. And so I want to make sure that I'm being consistent and get those really round and smooth. And these take a minute to get detailed with smooth edges. Okay, and once I have that consistent, I've made sure that it's as open as I want it to be, then I'll clean the edges up. Okay, so I'm going to tap it back on the table. Make sure I like those edges. And get it really, really clean. So everything that I do with this and all the edges I make are going to translate into the clay that I'm stamping. So I want to make sure they look just how I want. Now once I have that, I'm going to go back in with the edge of my knife, and instead of cutting this time, I'm just going to use it to press it into a square shape. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Now that I have that made, I can trim off all this excess clay that I don't need and save it for something else. This serves two purposes. The first purpose is it gives me a nicer handle to hold it with. And the second reason is it dries faster and I can get it fired in the kiln sooner. And I like to trim it down quite a bit. I don't like a stamp that's got a big grip area on it. So I like to get it to about there. Then I'm going to take it and squeeze it down so it's got smooth edges, and so that I like the way it feels when I hold it. And the last thing I'm going to do is flatten the top again and square up the outside edges again, just to make sure everything is nice and clean and smooth. So that's that stamp. Okay, now I'm going to set that aside and show you the other way. Okay, so the other way to do it to make a similar design is to take the clay that you have, and I'm going to start out with the same approach where I draw it on there. This time I'm outlining the outside edges of the lines. And I want to start with the same square shape. So I'm going to cut off this edge, and I'm going to give this a clean, just a little smooth down with my fingers. So now I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to outline that same shape again, but I'm outlining the edges of the lines because I'm going to take away everything that's outside of those lines. Make this get a little skinnier. Same thing here, making another coil, curling shape like that. Okay, now instead of carving the lines in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off the clay that's around them. I prefer this technique to the other one. I think it makes more interesting stamps. So all I'm going to do is take the fettling knife and I'm going to start pushing the clay down away from the edge of the stamp, getting rid of the clay parts that I don't need. I think that this gives a stamp that has more useful things that you can do with it. And so I'm just going around getting rid of any of the things that I don't want to be raised by pushing them down. And for a good clay stamp, you want like the thickness of the edge of a fettling knife, at least for how high it stands up from the rest of the stamp. That's the part you don't want to transfer. So I'm just getting in here and I'm pushing down the parts I don't need. Okay. And we will go back and smooth those up, but I just kind of take my finger and roll that clay out of the way. Now, one of the things I like with this technique is it's really easy to make straight lines because you're using a knife. And it's also easy to make curves because once I have pushed down the parts that I'm not going to use, I can just take my knife and swirl around it and make it smooth very easily. So I'm taking my tools, I'm pushing down the parts I don't need. And one of the easiest tricks for making curves is to hold the hand still, your dominant hand, and then to use the other hand that you're holding the object with, roll that hand to make a curving shape. And I do this with scissors, I do this with drawing tools, and it works really, really well. And you can see how much those curling shapes are standing up from the clay around it. And so I can do the same thing. I can just come over here, put my tool on that, and just roll. And look at how easily it gives me that really smooth edge. Okay, so I can take this and start tapping it on the table. And that's gonna smooth out my shapes. And so I'm just gonna keep going on this one until I have all the shapes that I want made. Can take this and use it to scoop clay towards the middle and then flatten it down. And I will keep going with that until I have the exact shapes that I want. And then the same way I did with the first stamp, I'm just going to cut away the parts I don't need so that I have this same shape. Okay, so similar stamp shapes made with a very different approach. This is the one I think is cooler. And I can even take these after they're made and bend them more this way so that they curve more. And so I feel like this approach gives you a stamp that's easier to manipulate your final forms. And so I'm going to keep going with this, clean this all out in the middle, and get it to exactly the shape that I want. And then cut away the unneeded clay so that I have a nice small stamp that fits nicely in my hands that will make the repeated pattern that I'm looking for this stamp. And that's how you do it. It's pretty straightforward. One thing I would say is just make sure that any interior open parts that you have been cut deeply enough out so that all of that will show the way you want it to when you're using it as a stamp for your clay projects. Okay? And just, of course, always take and test it and make sure it looks exactly the way you want before you set it out to dry. And any of these extra edges, I wrap them down so that they're not in the way when I'm stamping that. And that's how you approach it. Okay.